Well, this is the point in the day when you can all take a deep breath and put your feet up a little bit, because I'm going to just tell you things that you've heard before anyway. All I'll be doing is just repeating some things and maybe drawing one or two things out and raising just one or two questions. I don't want to be too long, but you've heard that before. But anyway, I've only got 20 minutes, so you're lucky, and then there's sort of a break. I want to start, obviously, the simplest thing to do is just go kind of speaker by speaker. There obviously are connecting threads that we will be able to pick up, and we should do that. But let's do justice to the individual papers. So starting, first of all, with Mark Kinzer's paper, Professor Kinzer, really a fascinating character, this person I'd never heard of before. And one's very tempted, I think, in these things always to try to look for where were his influences? And that is a kind of historian's question. And it's a question that's not a bad question, because historians can clarify things. They can shed light on things that otherwise we wouldn't quite get. Emphases, what is meant by a term when they use it. Well, it means the same thing as their teacher meant by it. So it's good to know who their teacher was, that kind of thing. But it's necessary, but it's not sufficient to get something from this theology of election. And I think I was very glad that we heard this morning really something not just about the man in his times or where he came from and where he was going, but actually something about really essential theological questions that were raised by that work. So it's really kind of living theology, as well as kind of, you might want to say, living dialogue. The idea that historic Israel is the vehicle of revelation is something which would not be unfamiliar to most students who've sat in a first-year class on Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, Israel as the vehicle of revelation. But what about Israel after the Bible? That might be something slightly, cause some more thinking to go on, because I think amongst evangelical Christians, so if I can speak at least for that side of the church, there's a little bit of a suspicion that even the church, the history of the church, is a vehicle for revelation. So why would the history of the Jews after the Bible be part of the history of Revelation? How could Israel, shall we say Israel AD, if we can put it that way, or CE, I think to be more ecumenical, how could that be a vehicle of revelation? And then that sort of made me, I think there's something that was raised today, and being historically minded, I can't help it. I started to think of Franz Rosenzweig and the influence that he may have had. I know that Yotes was at New College in Edinburgh, but you don't learn much at New College in Edinburgh. So I say that as somebody who's never worked at New College in Edinburgh, one of our rivals, you know. So he probably didn't pick anything up from John Bailey or whoever else was there. But of course, he picked up the influence of Karl Barth, which was very strong in Edinburgh in the 1950s. In fact, stronger than it ever would be in Switzerland or Germany, arguably. But the other person, but I did say that it was Rosenzweig that kind of put me in mind of Rosenzweig. And Rosenzweig, as you probably will remember, he talked about the importance of revelation through Scripture. And then I sort of sense that it's more than just Scripture, because it's also the interpretations of Scripture by both faith communities. And actually, where it got most interesting for Rosenzweig is to look at Jewish and Christian interpretations of key biblical concepts such as reconciliation, such as revelation, and kind of get the best of both worlds in his attempt to produce a theology which he felt was existential, like his friend Martin Buber would be able to stop speaking about God in the third person and allow us to, well, not to speak of God, but to listen to God speaking to us in the second person. And so the Scriptures are, as he says, a glorious text. It's something which has a charm, which charms us, and before we know where we are, we find ourselves being summoned through the voice of Scripture. Now there are Jewish things in there. You can hear the kind of the beginnings of sort of Leviticus Rabbah or something in there. You can hear a Barthian understanding or some kind of dialectical theological understanding in there too. But it's no worse for that. But let's get back, I think, to the point about God's character being made manifest, to quote jokes this morning from the ongoing history of the Jewish people, that the history of Israel has an ongoing revelational power. But I think what was very important in the detail was that when you read along that sentence, it says, and I was glad to have the text in front of me, so I didn't miss it. Maybe you missed it. That what does Israel do? What do the Jewish people do in their ongoing history? Continue to reveal one particular aspect of God's character, his faithfulness. Now, I don't want to make too much out of that, but one could, in some sense, resolve one or two sort of tricky issues between Jews and Christians by suggesting that what is being talked about there is not something primarily soteriological or even primarily theological in the sense of, who and what is God, but rather has to do with what God's will and purpose for creation is. In other words, to talk about God's faithfulness is God's faithfulness to creation, and obviously to peoples within creation, and of course here to the Jewish people. Because we see God's faithfulness to the Jewish people, we know that God is faithful to those whom he created and he loves, and we can kind of extrapolate for that and say, well, maybe God is going to be faithful and helpful to many of us, not just to the particular group of people. Something that I kind of heard when you were speaking, Adam, it kind of came to mind that one of the issues that we have in this sort of day of post nostra aetate is that if everyone's going to be saved anyway, it doesn't actually help to say to the Jews that they're going to be saved too. And to put it that way is rather kind of passive. Well, you're going to be part of it. I remember I had a colleague in my very first job, so it was my very first job. I was only there on sort of short term, so I couldn't say anything, of course. But these two people used to square up to each other. One was a New Testament theologian, very much a theologian, and the other one was a rabbi that we had teaching Judaism, a very small department. I won't say where it was. And of course, the New Testament guy used to say to the rabbi, of course, in my understanding of the gospel, you are saved. And I think the one he was, the one I went drinking with, turned around to him and said, "Well, what if I don't want to be your?" Just because it's a purely kind of passive thing. You're receiving some sort of Christian goods. It's like people who get kind of Christmas presents that they don't really want. But the person thinks it's that's a good CD. Everyone should have this kind of thing. That, I think, is kind of the paradigm that maybe we're in danger of getting into if we're taking a totally universalist paradigm, which just says that everybody's got any kind of piety is going to kind of, it's going to work out okay, and maybe for others who don't have piety too. And there is that kind of sense, isn't there, in Barth? I suppose Barth is pushing us in a particular way that Israel represents humanity in its rebelliousness. Now, Barth is subtle. He's not saying that Jewish people are all rebellious and the only way they're going to get saved is by God being really, really nice and patient with them. But there's something in that history of trying to make sense of what's going on particularly in the Gospels, that Barth actually says that the good news is that, and this has nothing really to do with the Jews actually, it's because the Jews are symbolizing something. What he's really interested in is what they're symbolizing, not in the question of the fate and destiny of the Jewish people as such, although he does have things to say about that. But he's actually much more interested in this question of, can a disobedient humanity, and of course that's the church as well, but we just happen to see it in the freeze frame of the Gospels as happening to be Jewish people that Jesus encounters at a particular time. Can those people nevertheless be saved by God? Can mercy extend to those who turn against God and God's representative, this particular prophet, Messiah, whoever he was? But I think that's something which we have, again, rather kind of muddies the water, because we're sort of saying again, well, there's not much place for the Jews to do anything in terms of kind of the ongoing purposes of God. They just have to kind of sit back and kind of wait. But then again, the same thing goes for Christians, the Christian church. There's a very kind of, Barth called his thing the church dogmatics. The church is kind of the place in which you do it, but because it's a place in which you do it, you don't actually make the place part of the characters and the action. The church is more the theatre, like the building or the church building. It's not actually in any sense, part of the dramatis personae in terms of kind of the history of salvation. And I think that's, so it's not just a problem for the Jewish people, though I think it becomes quite exacerbated in some of the particularly the Catholic Universalist kind of thinking, which tends to say that, why do we have an Old Testament? Why do we have one, but why do we read one? Why do we continue to read the Old Testament? Well, we continue to read the Old Testament because it's kind of it's a record, a kind of a sample of people longing for God, and people making a lot of mistakes, but people having some kind of religion that kind of keeps going, and it's all a mess. And then God comes along and cleans that up in the person of Jesus, and then in the church and the Holy Spirit and all that. But it's good to have a kind of preparation of, how not to do religion. But let's say, I think a Catholic writer, and I'm being generalizing any Catholics here, I'm hopefully generalizing, and it's a particular kind of brand, and I know there are different positions on this, which I've encountered. But there was a kind of a brand that would say at one point, this is just a kind of a preparation, it's a kind of the step you have to take before God comes and meets you, the kind of Old Testament religion. So, and this sounds like a Protestant caricature, and if it is, forgive me, but the sense of kind of you predispose yourself towards a grace that then comes and sort of takes you on further. Is that what the Old Testament is? And therefore, is that what Judaism is? Is that the kind of value of Judaism as a kind of, it shows us some sort of preparatory kind of piety that's going to kind of, pretty much get you into the right place, but that's not really what the main show is about. But I do think that Barth's stuff in 3.3 in the dogmatics on providence is very useful and very, typical with Barth, there's always surprises when you read Barth, when he says, there are 4 things which make me believe that God is a providential God who cares for the world and for history. And those 4 things are, 1, the history of the Bible, both in terms of the canon, the physical fact of the scriptures, and the effects of the Bible. So that's number 1. Number 2, church history. You might expect him to say church history, though of course he has a slightly kind of fancy way of putting that, which I won't read out, but it's a divine call despite resistance. Correction of the church, God allowing the church to wander, but always sort of managing to bring it back before complete disaster. Depends on your opinion what the limits of complete disaster are, but Barth is still at that point in the 1950s somewhat optimistic. Very interesting, I think, in Barth's writing on providence, that he's just slightly too early to take the Second World War, the Shoah, into account. It's almost as if the impact of that is felt in the 60s. And if Barth possibly been writing 3.3 in the 60s, I don't know, Joe, you probably have something to say about that, but that sort of sense that the people who then take that up, people like Dietrich Ritschl or something like that in the 60s will say, wait a minute, Barth, you don't really mention this terrible thing that happened. You talk sort of blithely about the history of the Jews. But the point is that number 3, in proofs for providence, or kind of demonstrations, as he puts it, I can't remember, it's not Belega, it's probably Beweisung or something. It's something that's slightly softer. It's not going to convince everybody sitting in this room that God exists and is a providential God, but that Barth says, the history of the Jews. That's my third exhibit. Or in light of their, as he puts it, this is the English translation, in light of their enigmatical character. It's not particularly good English, but the history of the Jews in the light of their enigmatical character and their survival. And again, I say there was a backlash against that because people would say, well, Barth, that's just sort of rather glib, isn't it? They survived, But put it positively, they've survived. They go on surviving. And Barth thinks that's important. That's up there with the history of the church. And then, of course, the last one is, what's the other proof of providence, this rather kind of enigmatic thing in Barth where he says, number 4, the limitation of our human lives. The fact that our lives come to an end is a proof of the providence of God. We can think about that, but that's not for today. That's why, in the sense of what Barth has just been saying about the importance of the history of the Jewish people for a Christian belief in providence, that's why I was a bit surprised why I saw good Presbyterians, such as the PCUSA in 1987, saying something like, as you reported it, as the cross of Jesus has always been a stumbling block to Jews, always, okay, fine. So also the continued existence and faithfulness of the Jews is often a stumbling block to Christians. which is interesting. I don't think back in 1987 I thought that the continuing existence of faith was the Jews was a stumbling block to anybody, but apparently it was a stumbling block to some Presbyterians who had not read their Bart. They had not kept their Bart close to their heart, nor had they read their Bailey Daily, which was a thing people used to say to ministers in training in the 1950s in Scotland, John Bailey being the teacher of Yates. Well, I think he's the teacher. I assume he was. He was certainly the principal of New College at that time. So, what is it for... So lastly, I've said that maybe the significance of, and I would say the significance of the Jewish people, but I also say the significance of the church, this sounds very Protestant here, is not essentially soteriological, but it's something which helps to reinforce our faith. It helps us to be assured in our faith. When we see that the church has continued under God's grace, when we see that the Jewish people have continued under the same God's grace, that gives us assurance, it gives us hope, it keeps us going. It doesn't necessarily redeem us in the way that I don't want to say that the church is, shall we say, an agent of my salvation. She may well be, and she is, an instrument in my salvation, but not an agent or a cause in anything other than some kind of low-level cause. This goes back to the Catholic Protestant question of whether Mary who embodies or symbolizes the church in her being, whether she can be called co-redemptrix. And of course, John Paul II himself said that Mary could not be called co-redemptrix, but co-mediatrix is probably okay because she mediates salvation to us, but she's not actually one who redeems. And I suppose I could just about accept that, although I may have some trouble with it. But the point is just to say that the church, just as the Jewish people, whether it be Israel or whether it be the church of the Gentiles, and then the church as a whole, whatever that might mean, that we're not talking such big stakes here, because we're not talking about soteriology, we're talking about the doctrine of providence and the doctrine of the church, which I think are very closely connected, as Barth himself saw. Now, as Barth's son Marcus, also taking up the theme of Jewish-Christian relations, which his father had kind of dipped his, well, more than his toe into, I would say he dipped his size 10 into at times. But Marcus Barth, I think you remember, famous for writing that commentary on Ephesians. What is it for the two to become one? And that's where I think we do have these issues of saying, along with what we heard this morning, about is there a church a kind of tertium quid? Did the church become one when Jesus Christ broke down the opposing wall and brought them together? Or and what you get is a rather grey, not very Jewish, not very Gentile, something kind of a mixture. And I think part of the sense of what I was hearing this morning was to say, well, wait a minute, we might want to say that in some sense, the covenant which God made with Israel, and the new covenant, which the New Testament talks about, that is one and the same covenant in terms of its essential character. But we don't want to go so far as to say, but it's just the same thing. Because if it were just the same thing, well, it would be a lot less interesting for a start. And I think where we've tended to find people emphasizing the monolithic nature of the covenant, we tend to miss something, particularly from the Jewish inheritance. Now, as Adam was saying towards the end there are plenty of things that Jews and Christians are not going to have to discuss. I mean, they'll just agree to differ. But that still leaves a lot to discuss. And those things are going to be, I imagine, I'm imagining kind of off the top of my head, will be things like, how do we live our lives as religious people who believe in the God of Israel? How do we agree on how can we kind of help each other to live this? What are our traditions of interpretation? What are our ethicists saying that we can actually come to? What can we say about what it means to the people of God? We can share that wisdom. That's wisdom to be shared. And I think that's something which I think means that we need to regard Jewish believers and Christian believers as differentiated in the way that we're always talking about Catholics and Protestants being differentiated. It's just a different way, differentiated about different things perhaps. Whether those things are more important or less important, I'm not going to say. But, differentiated consensus is something which I think we can certainly see going on between Jews and Christians on this. Which also brings me to the point of individualism. Paul Ricoeur, I think, is quite good on this, where he says that, this is in his book, Thinking Biblically, but he says, through revelation, God addresses himself to the individual soul and says, you love me. And that leads to some kind of dialogue going back and forward between the individual and God. But through the redemption that comes out of that dialogue, an expectation is opened up for us to take part in historical community. Suddenly we realize we've walked into a room and there are lots of other people in it. We thought when we were walking in it was just us being spoken to. And then we realized that there are these people who are having this sort of conversation as well, or have come into the same room. And then, so there is, as Ricoeur puts it, I think picking up from Buber and Rosenzweig, he says, in terms of a grammar of pronouns, there is the third person singular of creation, and narrative perhaps. And then there's the I, thou of revelation. But then there's the we of redemption and the kingdom. That took a long time, and I think I've sort of dotted between the kind of the first paper and the second paper, then the fourth paper. So I want to make sure I say something about the second and the third, the meat in the sandwich, or the peanut butter and jelly or something. What I got out of Chris Seitz's paper this morning was this kind of this porousness of Israel, which also made me think of the porousness of the church. That in the Hebrew Bible, there's an interest in the fringes. Okay, there's an interest in the core as well, but you can't have a core without fringes. You can't have fringes without a core. So I felt that was, what is it, the Lord Howlers of Jonah's sailor companions. Is that the phrase that you call them? The Lord Howlers. They were howling on the Lord. Was that your? I don't know if I picked that up wrongly, Chris, but I thought you heard you say that. I quite like that. The idea that they're calling on the Lord sort of left, right, and center, even they've got absolutely no idea who it is. In the same way that when Saul is on the road to Damascus, he says, who are you, Lord? And some of the commentators say, he's just calling him polite. He's pretty afraid, so he says, I better call you sir. But, we know from intertextuality that there's more going on than that in Luke's account. So calling on the Lord. Then this sense of revelation again as a summons to people to take part in something larger than themselves. And the address to the calling on of the invocation, not on the Lord by Chris, but the calling on the priestly writer as using Elohim not in such a way to drag people back to their kind of pagan origins where there was just some kind of God, we just God, or gods, plural kind of form. But while making connections outside of Yahwism, so extending the tense of Yahwism, not in any sense going back, not in any sense undercutting, but adding to it, going further. That the priestly writer is a monotheist in a way that, in a different way from the Deuteronomist. If the Deuteronomist is somewhat exclusive, or exclusivist, and defining, the priestly writer is inclusive and integralist. That kind of monotheism of a very ambitious sort. And if the covenant is of that sort, in the priestly kind of conception of it, again, and this is what Brevard Chowser reminds us of, you don't have like P and D sort of fighting each other for space, and one, in the end you get a bit of both because they've kind of cancelled each other out. But a sense of the whole symphony of the scriptural witness. But the scriptural witness, as well as it being open to within itself, and arguably open to a fulfillment, whether that be in Christian or Jewish terms, say a fulfillment, continuation might be a better word for it. Also, that means that the church is open, and it means that Israel is also open. And I think the last thing from Chrissy's talk, which he said towards the end, that to remember, I think in the part of the Q&A, that we have to remember that as people in New Testament times were very aware, and we tend to forget, we are not the people. The not people have become the people. But our identity is always not the people. In the way that I'm Reformed, so I can't help this, a reading of Romans 7, I'm Augustinian, will insist that while we, being in Christ, we are justified, we also know that our ongoing existence is that we are also sinners. We cannot, the good that we would do, we do not do. And there's an ecclesiological version of that. We continue to be not the people even while we are being made into the people. Paul, in Romans 3, says, what advantage then has the Jew? This came up from Chris, who mentioned this. And so, well, many things, chiefly because that unto them were committed the oracles of God. But Paul goes on, doesn't he, later to say, later on in Romans 11, he says, they are Israelites, and to them belong the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the worship, and the promises. So they're not just useful. There's not just a benefit because they happen to pass on the oracles of God. I mean, Augustine has a version of that. He just says, why do we bother with, what good are the Jews? And Augustine sort of says, well, at least they kind of, they gave us the scriptures. We wouldn't have... And he gets that maybe from Romans 3, but if you read on in Romans, Paul has another go. Patriarchs and the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the worship, the promises, a whole religion, which then gets filled out or adapted, I suppose, for Christian purposes. I want to lastly say something about Terry's paper because I've got to in that kind of funny order. And I think these are kind of huge issues, and they're kind of issues which I'm not very familiar with. I must confess I've never read people like Daniel Boyarin, and I've never read kind of what you would call the kind of the sociological approaches to the ancient world, the kind of anthropological stuff that Terry is familiar with. So I learned a lot and was grateful. But I got a sense out of him of saying that in one sense it was a challenge that as Western Christianity is losing its flavor, or is in danger of losing its flavor at times, or losing its direction or sense of confidence, to put it that way, it could be that the Jewish people will help us the church that is, to know what it is to formulate a faith which will have more confidence once more. I think I heard that. Where is Terry? Is he around? Oh, you're in the corner. I didn't see you. And I think this goes back to a little bit, what were the early Christians doing when they started to call themselves a people or even a nation? And I think what they were doing was that they were taking advantage of what they already had, and that was a sense of identity as Jews, but of course they thought themselves as sort of Jews plus. Now, of course, they didn't use that term of being Israel until 100 years later, by which time things have changed. But I don't know if I take such a completely negative view of that development. In other words, I think one can have a strong sense of identity, to use sort of terms like that, and this is going to sound controversial because we're aware of the various Israel and adversus Judaeus tradition, appropriation of Israel by the church. But in my reading of many of the church fathers, and they're meant to be the most kind of anti-Semitic of the lot and anti-Jewish of the lot, when we get into the sort of let's Justin and Trypho, that's one debate, but maybe slightly later than that, Origen, for example, and even Augustine, as Paula Fredrickson has shown, there are points where there's this kind of sense of we want to call ourselves the new Israel, or have that kind of sense of taking that on ourselves for two reasons. First of all, we think it's a pretty good thing to want to be because look at the faithful of the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. We're unworthy to tie their shoelaces. We look upon the psalmist, we look upon Moses, we look upon the prophets as people of inspirational character. And that's something, and so it's a bad move in the long run to appropriate the titles of Israel for yourself. But it's that side of mimesis, which, people say, that imitation is in some sense, the greatest form of flattery. And I think there is that. And the second thing is more kind of historical. We need to discuss this at longer length, but what's happening to the Jewish people? Lots of not very nice things under the Romans in the late 1st and then early 2nd century. Another dispersion. A sense in which Judaism could very easily become invisible in the Roman Empire, less so than it had been around about the time of Christ. And therefore, when you get, Eusebius being triumphalistic and saying, Christianity is the one big religion and Constantine likes it too, so everything's great, where I don't know if that's actually opposing, should be seen as sort of necessitating a kind of dislike or despising of religions that are not doing as well. And quite often I think when people when Epiphanius draws up his lists of all the kind of heresies he doesn't like, and there's Jews in those lists, it's because the Jews are like Arians. It's not because the Arians are like Jews. If the Jews are heretical for the Christian church of the patristic period, it actually is because Jewish belief as understood, and not particularly well investigated, seems to be a bit something like kind of the heretics that the church has been trying to be dealing with. That's not to excuse, shall we say, the rhetoric of John Chrysostom at times when, for example, he feels he's going to lose some of his people to the synagogue, possibly, and some of that rhetoric is just kind of unusable and unhelpful. But I would also say it's actually fairly rare, maybe more rare than you would think. And that the church, if you look at something like Cyril of Alexandria talking about what it means to worship in spirit and truth, Cyril of Alexandria doesn't say, we worship in spirit and truth now, and when the Jews were doing it in the past, that was all material and kind of sensual. Not at all, quite the opposite. He goes through passages and kind of in the Pentateuch and the Torah, and he just says, that's for our instruction. So can we, in some sense, let's kind of revise our revisions. Let's make sure that we are properly getting into the spirit of what it means. Now, you could say that some of the texts of the New Testament were hostages to fortune, and that will demand that you have a certain kind of approach to scriptural authority and the nature of scriptural inspiration. We all say that it was Luther's fault that, to some degree, a lot of people say, it was Luther's fault that the Holocaust took place. There was a causative element there. Are we going to say that Paul and Peter in their New Testament writings are responsible for later misuse? Are we going to say what we might say about Matthew, that, his blood be on our heads and on our children, that Matthew is responsible for it? These are complicated issues, how one deals with what people do with texts, proof texting, taking a text out of its context and using it, universalizing it. So with that, I think I've kind of run into the ground, and I think I will cede the floor. Thank you.